I think there's something wonderfully fitting about my participating in a lecture series titled The Trouble Begins. In noting this, I don't want to come across as self-indulgent or vain. It's just that trouble and me, we seem to go together. That's at least how I think those who know me best, my friends, my family, my daughters, my fiance, my coworkers, most definitely my students, would all confirm that I like to get into trouble, in the best and worst senses of the word. I like to mix things up. I might take a little too much pleasure in certain conventional transgressions. Winston Churchill is alleged to have said, quote, "I like a man who grins when he fights." I like that. Whether he said it or not, it's something I've tried to live up to. So let's have some fun and maybe start a little trouble. But of course, being trouble is different than being troubling, though perhaps some of you will find my comments tonight a little troubling. If by troubling we mean confusing or unclear, incoherent, then that would be bad. What I have to say tonight might be difficult, but I will do my very best to be clear. But if, on the other hand, my comments about Mark Twain were to trouble, that is, unsettle, disturb, unmoor, call into doubt some of the long-standing views and opinions held about Twain, then I will have struck my mark, pun intended. But before the trouble can really begin, a few words of thanks are in order. To Joe Lamack and the Center for Mark Twain Studies, thanks for inviting me back to Elmira and Quarry Farm. Joe and the good people at CMTS were kind enough to have me here for 2 weeks back in 2023, a visit that allowed me to complete some of the important research on the book that was recently published in fall of 24, which reminds me that I should thank my editor at Palgrave Macmillan, Christian Winting, for not only shepherding my book through the production and editing process, but frankly for helping me to get it published in the first place. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with academic publishing, but you can just imagine the reaction of academic publishers when I approached them with this idea of a 300-page commentary on a book by Twain that no one reads. They were, they want anything to do with it. So I owe no small debt of gratitude to Christian Winting at Palgrave, as well as to Tim Burns and Tom Pengel, who edit this series, Recovering Political Philosophy, of which my book is a part. Now, as Joe has mentioned, my visit in 2023 included the opportunity to deliver a talk at the Park Church on Twain's Joan as a Machiavellian princess. Perhaps some of you have seen it, maybe not. But my intention in that talk was simple: to establish as much as possible that Twain's last complete novel, the one he called his best, was deeply informed by and in conversation with the classic texts of Western political philosophy. And moreover, that Twain presented his novel's heroine as a Machiavellian founder of the modern world. By doing that, I hope to begin to persuade the broader Twain reading and Twain-loving public, specialists and enthusiasts alike, to take seriously this master of American literature as a source of political wisdom on par with the likes of a Xenophon, a Plato, Machiavelli, Bacon, Cervantes, Shakespeare, Rousseau. You get the idea. Now, showing that Twain and his novel on Joan of Arc were informed by, or in some way, a conversation with the questions, texts, and figures associated with Western political philosophy, that's one thing. It's another thing altogether to show the political wisdom to be gained by approaching his novels as works of political philosophy. That is the intention of tonight's remarks. As my title indicates, the political wisdom of Twain's that I hope to share with you concerns the specific nature or aspect of his critique of the divine right of kings. To be specific, I'm going to argue that Twain, in the last complete novel that he published in his life, provides the political grounds for rejecting the view of divine providence that underlies the belief in and practice of divine right of kings. The book's argument, Personal Recollections' argument against that providential God, is grounded in its argument for man's moral and political nature. And that nature, embodied chiefly in the novel's narrator, the Sieur Louis de Conte, expressly hopes for a divinity that accords with and fulfills his longings for an earthly justice and nobility that are impossible to fulfill on terms set by those longings themselves. So as should be evident, my talk takes up a subject that concerns Twain's interest in religion, and that is a subject that's been well trod by scholars. What's been, I think, less appreciated is the extent to which Twain addressed seriously the moral and theological beliefs in favor of divine providence. In other words, Twain's handling of the question of whether a providential God can be said to exist goes far beyond what I would think are the more sophomoric carpings characteristic of amateur or freshman philosophy students, whose objections to this possibility consist in noting things like, well, bad things happen to good people, or the world is an imperfect place, or human beings are made of warped wood. Yeah, no kidding. All of these are acknowledged, for instance, by Catholic moral teaching and theology. But that acknowledgement in no way constitutes a refutation of Catholic belief in a providential God. A more complete position would require addressing on their own terms the more commonly held views that human beings have about divine providence, and with which Catholic teaching is, I think, largely consistent. One of Twain's novels, Connecticut Yankee, states that as its intention. Despite its fame as a medieval sci-fi adventure story, Connecticut Yankee is at once a deeply political book and centrally focused on the question of divine providence. Twain foregrounds the political approach this novel will take to this most important religious question in the author's preface of the American edition of the novel. There, Twain declares that he wanted to explore the possibility that a deity exists which so concerns itself with the welfare of human beings that it should bother to select rulers of nations who possess the necessary traits to tend to the good of their particular communities. Twain writes that the question as to whether there is such a thing as the divine right of kings is not settled in this book. It is found too difficult. That the executive head of a nation should be a person of lofty character and extraordinary ability was manifest and indisputable. That the deity ought to make that selection then was likewise manifest and indisputable. Consequently, that he does make it as claimed was an unavoidable deduction. I mean, until the author of this book encountered the Pompadour and Lady Castlemaine and some other executives of that kind. These were found so difficult to work into the scheme that it was judged better to take the other tack in this book, which must be issued this fall, and then go into training and settle the question in another book. It is, of course, a thing that ought to be settled, and I'm not going to have anything particular to do next winter anyway. So Twain presents us here with a syllogism about the divine right of kings. And that syllogism, I think, is premised on a political imperative, that it be manifest and indisputable that the executive of a nation possess lofty character and extraordinary ability. It's manifest and indisputable that they should possess these traits because they make and enforce the laws that determine how we live our lives. In the ordinary course of events, laws prevent us from gratifying our desires at the expense of others, regardless of how good or bad that gratification might prove to be for us as individuals. And in the most extreme cases, laws and those who make them call for us to willingly lay down our lives for someone or something else. So if legislators don't possess the character and ability to make laws that are good for you and for me, then given the stakes involved, we might not want to obey those laws or the executives who enforce them. It's imperative then that those who must live under these laws and these rulers understand the authority by which they are ruled. Does their authority come from God? Or is the goodness of their laws grounded in human virtue? Does it come from convention? Force? Fraud? In the case of Connecticut Yankee, however, Twain limits himself to two candidates for this right: the progressive view of history and the divine right of kings? Which one of them more manifestly and indisputably produces executives that secure the human good? Which one authorizes the kind of political order that deserves our loyalty and devotion? Around which should we organize our lives? Consider for a moment the way Twain frames the religious alternative here. That alternative to the progressive view of history is not some deistic God who, having created the universe, sits back and watches human events unfold without ever intervening in them. Rather, the alternative to historical progress that Twain presents here is a God who cares for us, cares for the welfare of particular human communities, who possesses the wisdom about their good, who can identify the human beings equipped with the moral and intellectual abilities to secure that good, and who has the power to, and subsequently does, place those individuals in political office. Implicit in all of this is the notion that God not only actively intervenes in our affairs, but that he does so in a manner that is both just and scrutable. This last part is important. And it's important because if the selection of a divine right king was chosen, say, with a view of character and ability that somehow defied our human intelligibility, our ability to grasp it, then you couldn't hope to say, as Twain does, that the king's divine selection was manifest and indisputable. At most, you'd have to reserve human judgment in this matter. If the Almighty selected a king, as king, an individual known only for his lawlessness or for his skill at murdering women and children, then such a ruler could still theoretically bear the imprimatur of the Lord. But you wouldn't say that their selection as king was just, not at least as ordinary, decent opinion understands justice. Such a ruler would appear to be more like a tyrant and less like a king. And the deity who installed that tyrant in office would appear arbitrary and capricious towards the good of human beings. In fact, if we couldn't say that the selection of a tyrant as ruler of a nation was just, then we couldn't confirm as manifest and indisputable the premise that he was divinely appointed to this office. After all, nobody speaks of the divine right of tyrants. So it seems then that Twain prioritizes not only human justice, but its scrutability as a necessary condition for ratifying the divine right of kings. In sum, then, Twain's repeated insistence on the manifest and indisputable character of his deductions concerning the divine right of kings subordinates the questions about providence to the opinions we have about justice and the human good. For evidence that Twain himself might have adopted this approach to the question of God's providence and justice, one should consult the letter he wrote to his wife, Olivia, on July 17, 1889. There, Twain wrote, "We do see and feel the power of what we call God. We do see it and feel it in such measureless fullness that we ought to infer, not justice and goodness from that, but we may from another thing, namely the fact that there is a large element of justice and goodness in his creature, man. And we may also infer that he has within him injustice and ungoodness, because he has put those in man too. Next, I am privileged to infer that there is far more goodness than ungoodness in man. For if it were not so, man would have exterminated himself before this. And I may also infer this supremacy in equality of goodness over ungoodness in man, by calling up in my mind the various servants whom I know, the various mechanics whom I know, the various merchants, military men, the various Tom, Dick, and Harrys of all walks of life whom I know. In this long list I find goodness the rule and ungoodness the exception. I should still find this the case among all tribes of savages in all parts of the earth and in all the centuries of history. I detest man, but nevertheless this is true of him. Well, since what we call God made that preponderance of goodness, he must have done it because he admired it, and must have admired it because he discovered it to be his own principal feature. At this point, then, I draw another inference, that he is as good and as just as man is, to place the likelihood at its lowest term. And if this is so, I arrive at this result. I am plenty safe enough in his hands. I am not in any danger from that kind of deity. The one that I want to keep out of the reach of is the caricature of him that one finds in the Bible. We, that one and I, could never respect each other, never get along together. I have met his superior 100 times. In fact, I amount to that myself. I don't know anything about the hereafter, but I'm not afraid of it. The further I get away from the superstitions in which I was born and mistrained, the more the idea of a hereafter commends itself to me, and the more I am persuaded that I shall find things comfortable when I get there. Now, if this letter is more than just, say, a husband's attempt to assuage his wife's more pious sensibilities, if it reflects in some way, say, Twain's genuine approach to this thorny theological matter, then given everything I've said thus far, we might reasonably expect to discover the rational basis for Twain's approach in Connecticut Yankee. But we would be wrong. As he confesses at the beginning of the preface, which I quoted earlier, Twain didn't settle the issue of the divine right of kings in that book. That issue, he says at the end of the preface, would need to be settled in another book, one he would begin training for next winter. That book, I claim, turns out to be Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc. Personal Recollections adopts the perspective sketched in the preface to Connecticut Yankee and echoed in Twain's letter to his wife. And I think this can be seen chiefly in the views and character, again, of that work's narrator, the Sieur Louis de Conte, especially in his views of Joan's justice and nobility. Opinions which prove, I think, foundational to his view of her, not merely as divinely authorized, but divine herself. For instance, de Conte introduces his memoirs of Joan by noting that as the decades drifted by and the spectacle of her career, quote, grew ever more strange and wonderful and divine and pathetic, he came to recognize that Joan was the most noble life that was ever born into this world, save only one. At the close of his memoirs, de Conte returns to this theme, singing the praises of Joan's singular nobility. I have finished my story of Joan of Arc, that wonderful child, that sublime personality, that spirit which in one regard has had no peer and will have none. This is purity from all alloy of self-seeking, self-interest, personal ambition. In it, no trace of these motives can be found, search as you may. This cannot be said of any other person whose name appears in profane history. Now, this is a seemingly outsized assessment of Joan's character, and it appears almost incredible. But de Conte's account of Joan's life appears to substantiate these amazing claims. Based on his earliest memories, Joan consistently demonstrated a concern with alleviating the suffering of others at her own expense, even and perhaps especially when those others were her rivals. Thus, in her first act of noble self-sacrifice, recorded in the novel, a 7-year-old Joan pours over her own head ashes that were meant as punishment for Domrémy's village priest, Father Fronte. As de Conte tells it, Joan's heroism here was occasioned by a scandal involving the Arbre Fée de Bourlemont. This is a majestic beech tree that marked the noble open space near the haunted woods of their village. You see, Joan had reproached the village priest because he banished the fairies who adorned the beech tree and whom the children loved, effectively ending a pagan practice some 500 years old. Speaking on behalf of her peers, a heartbroken Joan, remember she's 7, convinced Father Fronte that he had acted wrongly to banish the fairies as he did, and thus merited correction for such an ill-considered deed. The priest agrees and proposed putting on sackcloth and ashes. But no sooner had Joan agreed to this punishment that she discovered what it would mean. Incapable of endorsing such a profanation, de Conte's word, of the local priest, Joan embraced his punishment as her own, and in doing so assumed, quote, a humble martyrdom, unquote, pouring ashes over her own head. The young Joan foreshadows her own fiery end. Now, for de Conte, Joan's selflessness constitutes the defining trait of her childhood. Twain shows us this nobility at work in the care that she alone gives to the village madman, a man named Théophile Benoit. She does so at great risk to herself. We also see her giving aid to animals and homeless soldiers at her own expense. Indeed, when she saved de Conte and their friends from the axe-wielding madman, Théophile Benoit had gotten out of his cage and went nuts and was going to attack the kids with this axe. A preteen Joan stops him, later explains to her peers that her desire to save others from harm outweighed her fear for herself. On this, our narrator observed, "It is noticeable that this remark, which implies that Joan was entirely forgetful of herself and her own danger, had thought and wrought for the preservation of other people alone, was not challenged or criticized or commented on by anyone else, but was taken by all as a matter of course and true." De Conte thus notes, the sure and the only way to rouse her up and set her on fire was not to appeal to her self-interest, but to show her where some other person was going to suffer wrong or hurt or loss. It's not surprising then that in a village dedicated to the Armagnac cause, with its support of the Dauphin's claims to the French throne, a child known for such selfless service to others should earn the nickname the Patriot. In de Conte's words, our warmest feeling for our country was cold beside hers. And de Conte's account of Joan's meteoric political and military career testifies to this, testifies to her willingness to risk life and limb for the cause of her country and her countrymen. She frequently led her own marches through enemy territory. She shared in all the hardships with her men. She spearheaded assaults against the enemy, even when she had prophesied her own wounds, and she embraced her own martyrdom. But no deed, that's impressive, but no deed, I think, outshines what Joan says about her love of France. When repeatedly pressed by Charles the Dauphin to name her reward for service rendered for her country, Joan declined ennoblement and declined a quarter of the crown and the lilies of France, and instead replied, to be allowed to work for France, to spend oneself for France, is itself so supreme a reward that nothing can add to it. Nothing. Give me the one reward that I ask, dearest of all rewards, the highest in your gift. March with me to Rheims and receive your crown. I will beg it on my knees. Even at the end of her life, as she faced the flames, Joan prayed not for herself, but for the French king. De Conte marks that as she prepared to meet her death, Joan never thought of the king's treacheries to her. She never thought of his desertion of her. She never remembered that it was because he was an ingrate, that she was here to die a miserable death. She remembered only that he was her king, that she was his loyal and loving subject. And so, in the very presence of death, de Conte states, Joan forgot her own troubles, to implore all in her hearing to be just to Charles VII, to believe that he was good and noble and sincere, and not in any way to blame for any acts of hers, but being wholly clear and free of all responsibility for them. Wow. I mean, I have to ask, I have to wonder, I have to think myself, could you improve on such a portrait of noble selflessness? Is this not in some ways the peak of nobility, the total surrender of your own good for the good of another, even when that other doesn't deserve it. Of course, as we've seen through her martyrdom, Joan recalls that first deed of hers that was recorded by de Conte, right? The pouring the ashes over her head, adopting for herself a punishment that would probably be more fitting for Charles VII. For while her village priest wrongly banished the fairies from what Joan had considered their God-given land, Charles, this allegedly divine right king, failed to banish the English from soil that God bestowed on the French. Whereas the fairies had rights to the arbre fait de Bourlemont, the English have no right to rule France. Joan's sacrifice for France and her king thus represents the culmination of a lifetime of noble service, made all the more noteworthy for her consistent willingness to tend to the needs not just of her friends, not just of her soldiers, not just of her allies, but of her enemies, and to take upon herself sufferings that belong to others. It is this singular capacity for self-sacrifice that allows Louis de Conte and her devoted followers, I almost said worshipers, to equate her to Jesus Christ. Given this portrait, again, it seems only reasonable to conclude that de Conte and all warm-blooded French patriots would look to Joan as the divine means for securing their justice on earth, right? From the perspective of the French who had been oppressed throughout the 100 Years' War, this instrument of the Almighty would surely have as one of its ends the political liberation of the French from their hated English foes. But wait, there's more. Joan becomes, in the eyes of her faithful servants, the divinely authorized means by which any apparent imperfections in a world that's believed to be ordered to the human good can be rectified, preserved, or remedied. Thus, Joan tells the besieged of Orleans that her victory there will provide them with a quote-unquote noble shad. That is, a noble fish, or what we might call an ichthyos, Greek word for fish, right? That becomes an acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. She will give them the noble shad, the noble fish that will nourish and sustain the deepest political hopes of her countrymen. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? There's a problem with all of this. And it's not just that Twain's Joan doesn't live up to the portrait of a noble, just, selfless patriot that's painted by de Conte. And by the way, as someone whom I have elsewhere characterized as a Machiavellian manipulator, Twain's Joan most certainly doesn't live up to this image. No, that's not the problem. The problem is that de Conte's own views about the goodness of devotional self-sacrifice are problematic on their own terms. And these problems become most evident when we read about his romantic failures. Yeah, his romantic failures. Because it's in those failures where we see that at the bottom of all of his views of Joan, at the bottom of his views about her nobility and her justice and her practical divinity, there's this hope for a cosmos, a world that is ordered towards the human good. Now, the particular romantic failure that looms largest in the novel is de Conte's attempt to win the heart not of Joan, but of Catherine Boucher. Catherine was the daughter of an Orléanois family, a girl that de Conte says was as beautiful as Joan herself. Unfortunately, our narrator is a loser in the affairs of the heart. Of all the suitors who sought Catherine's favor, she bestowed her affections on one Edmund Aubrey Jr. The son of the mayor of Domremy, Aubrey Jr. was one of Joan's childhood friends who served in her personal staff as her standard bearer. Nicknamed the Paladin by his peers for his ability to spin comically outrageous lies about himself, Aubrey's shameless but harmless braggadocio also won him the goodwill and affection of his many captivated listeners. Against such a rival, our narrator de Conte endeavored, quote, to win the least little attention out of the 1,000 that this beloved girl was lavishing on Aubrey. So what does he do? He comes up with a scheme. The scheme consists in writing a poem for her entitled The Rose of Orleans. The poem was composed of 2 parts, both with 8 separate 4-line rhyming stanzas, each of which ended with a 2-line refrain. And that refrain is, oh, tears, hot tears, oh, sweet, sad tears. That means that the bulk of the poem is this perpetual repetition. Oh, sweet tears, sad tears, 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 tears. Ay, ay, ay. Now, the first part of the poem tells of how the Rose of Orleans, ashamed at man's sinful nature, brings an end to war and restores civic order through the enchanting perfume of her flower. Here, nature, in the form of a rose, harmonizes our political realm. But in the second stanza, the metaphor of the rose is replaced by the moon. While the rose puts an end to violent motion, the moon, in the second stanza, inspires heavenly bodies to gravitate towards it. And it issues in new movements too. When the heavenly bodies discover that their lunar center bestows its affection on a man who agonizes for her love, they weep shooting stars. Oh, sweet tears, such sad tears. In this stanza, love reorders nature and makes man's pathos the center of the world. Now, taken as a whole, de Conte's poem is balanced, symmetrical, harmonious, and celebrates the power of nature to order politics and love's ability to reorder the world. It thus testifies to its author's hope for a universe that is, again, ordered and intelligible and rewards those who suffer on behalf of someone or something else. So that's the scheme this guy's cooked up, right? Yeah, I'm going to win this girl's heart through this poem. Except the plan was not for him to read the poem. The plan was for his buddy, Noel Rangwison, this perpetual agitator of Paladin. He was going to offer a public and pathetic recitation of this poem. And that, he thinks, is going to move the heart of his beloved. I don't know why he didn't think she might fall in love with the guy who's reciting the poem instead of him. Who knows? But this guy clearly doesn't think this stuff through. The problem is, it all goes to naught, right? The whole thing gets upended because Paladin, who's in the office, in the audience, starts blubbering, right? He's listening to this blubbering overreaction with its loud cries, its tears, its sniffles. These are right out of the novel. Its retchings, barkings, and snortings not only interrupts the staged reading, but is so outrageous that it moves his fellow listeners not to tears, but to laughter. Laughter in which Joan herself participated. Well, it didn't work. The effect of the poem was spoiled by Paladin, but it wasn't de Conte's last opportunity to make his affections known to his beloved. Not long after this disaster, de Conte, while visiting Joan's quarters, observed his friend gently reprove Catherine for suggesting to her that the commander of all armies in France, Joan, should steer clear of battle so as to avoid injury. Joan resists this. In response to her nobility, bravery, and wisdom, Catherine herself breaks down and weeps. De Conte's reaction bears reading in full. I did so want to take her into my arms and comfort her, but Joan did it. And of course I said nothing. Joan did it well, and most sweetly and tenderly. But I could have done it as well, though I knew it would be foolish and out of place to suggest such a thing, and might make an awkwardness too, and be embarrassing to us all. So I did not offer. And I hope I did right and for the best, though I could not know, and was many times tortured with doubts afterwards, as perhaps as having perhaps let a chance pass which might have changed all my life and made it happier and more beautiful than, alas, it turned out to be. For this reason, I grieve yet. By the way, this is being dictated at the age of 82. He's recalling this at 82. Yeah. Well, he could have done something. For this reason, I grieve yet when I think of that scene, and do not like to call it up out of the deeps of my memory because of the pangs that it brings. So, de Conte doesn't act here because he's afraid. He's afraid that an action like this would be improper or out of order, and that a transgression of social etiquette would be embarrassing for all involved. You know, a sense of what is seemly, proper. That's what's keeping him in check. Fear of violating the proper etiquette. That checks his romantic longings. Now, part of de Conte's torture, the pangs that memory of this moment brings, stems from the fact that while he hoped he did right and for the best, such actions were not clearly right or best for him. De Conte's restraint here might well serve the good belonging to proper etiquette, but as his doubts attest, the goodness of this moral act for him, the agent of the moral deed, is by no means self-evident or manifest and indisputable. After all, he lives the rest of his life alone. His life lacks a measure of beauty and of happiness, as he confesses, due to his failure here. Reflecting again on the joyous reception, again he's looking back, right? He's 82, he's looking back on the reception that Joan received upon returning to Orleans. A now aged de Conte laments, "But at last we crowded through to our old lodgings, and I saw old Boucher and the wife and that dear Catherine gather Joan to their hearts and smother her with kisses. And my heart ached so, for I could have kissed Catherine better than anybody, and more, and longer. Yet was not thought of for that office, and I was so famished for it. Ah, she was so beautiful, and oh, so sweet. I had loved her the first day I ever saw her, and from that day forth she was sacred to me. I have carried her image in my heart for 63 years, all lonely there, yes, solitary, for it never has had company. And I'm grown so old, so old. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be laughing through this, but it's so over the top. But it is as fresh and young and merry and mischievous and lovely and sweet and pure and witching and divine as it was when it crept in there, bringing benediction and peace to its habitation so long ago, for it has not aged a day." Well, listen, if justice isn't simply serving the good of others, if it's also to be good for the just man, him or herself, then the good for de Conte that comes from his restraint here, right, his erotic or romantic restraint, and it comes, as he admits, at a life-altering cost for him. The good of that act, the good for him, that's got to come from somewhere else. Given his Christian piety and his faith in the visions of the fairy tree, it's not unreasonable, again, to think that he looks to heaven for the reward of his earthly sacrifice. But yet, the thing is, de Conte fears death throughout the whole novel. He fears death. And that means that fear of death, his faith is faith, it ain't knowledge. And so lack of certainty about what comes after death, and therefore doubt about the existence of a providential deity who rewards the good and punishes the wicked, dogs our narrator throughout his life, and is only partially assuaged near the end of his life by the vision of the tree, right, that allegedly comes to all those who are sinless. Let's try and put this together then, right? Well, what do we have here? What kind of character do we have here? It seems like Louis de Conte lives trapped in a rather unenviable position, right? On the one hand, he's willing to be a gentleman for his beloved, but he's not sure that that gentlemanly restraint is good for him. On the other hand, his natural fear of death and his doubt about the immortality of the soul don't lead him or inspire him to take a more active approach to the pursuit of his own goods, at least till he can be convinced it makes sense to do otherwise. Nor do they cause him to stop, reflect about the nature of the world, to wonder what happens to us after we die, or to explore his own convoluted hopes that people get rewarded for their goodness on the grounds that the good acts constituting their goodness aren't good enough in themselves because they require additional goods to reward them. I think that is just a mess. This guy is a mess. Unwilling to act for his own good and unwilling to abandon his hopes that the good will be rewarded for their moral selflessness, what does de Conte do? He takes shelter in the passive hope that the world is ordered to ensure a happy outcome for those who aspire to moral goodness. He's like that moon in the second stanza of that poem. Everyone's going to come together to protect him and weep for him and give him what he needs because he's not getting the love he feels he deserves. It's precisely these hopes that lie behind his outrage, noted throughout the novel. He also is a very angry man at times, right? Especially emphasized in Book 3. Outrages at the injustices perpetrated by the English-backed church against Joan and her cause of French liberation. It's what fuels his repeated confidence, both in her ultimate vindication and his confidence in the punishment of her enemies, even as he does virtually nothing to bring those about. And yet, neither de Conte nor, according to our narrator, the villagers of Domremy, are content to leave it with just hopes and beliefs. It's a staple of faith for those who believe in the fairy tree, that the goodness of their devotion to it will be confirmed by a vision of the tree that comes to the saved before they die. In other words, their faith in this passage, their willingness to celebrate the fairy tree, rests in part on the demand for a proof or demonstration of its veracity. Their convictions require convincing. Intertwined with their belief is a demand that its promises and rewards be confirmed in this life and in terms they can understand for themselves. In other words, that it's scrutable, that it be manifest and indisputable. Now, given what we've seen thus far, this confirmation that they're looking for is likely to prove elusive, since what they hope to have confirmed is the reality or the existence of a justice whose goodness consists in devotional sacrifice. That is, again, the sacrifice of one's own good on behalf of someone or something else, which also and at the same time happens to constitute the greatest good for the individual who's exercising it. You can't have it both ways. Are you sacrificing your own good, or are you pursuing your greatest good? The beliefs would have them both ways. You see, de Conte, his fellow believers of the fairy tree, and in Joan, they can't get the confirmation they most desperately seek because it's impossible to confirm something that violates the law of non-contradiction. And without that confirmation, without a rational grasp of the coherence and the existence of the good in question, here again that good is the justice and nobility that stands at the heart of their belief in Joan's godliness. Absent that, how can they reasonably be devoted to someone like Joan and all that she represents? How can her claim to divinely authorized rules satisfy the criteria of being, again, manifest and indisputable? I don't have an answer for that. Now, let me say at this point that someone could offer a number of objections to the picture I've painted thus far, not the least of which is that the character embodied by Sieur Louis de Conte is in no way representative of a genuine religious believer in, say, its Catholic or more broadly Christian forms. That might well be true. That might well be true. But I think there's good reason to think that Twain sees it that way. That is, there's good reason to think that Twain thinks his presentation of de Conte's opinions about justice and nobility and the kind of character or soul that issues in those opinions represents a deliberate, targeted blow against the church. Now let me offer here, this is my last section, let me offer here a few general words in closing to indicate why Twain might have thought the preceding presentation took accurate aim at Christian and especially Catholic theology on divine providence. They're going to be general remarks here. For those interested in a more detailed analysis of Twain's approach to Catholic theology than I can give here, I would direct them to chapter 10 of my book, shameless plug, okay? All right. So let me restate kind of where we are here so we can get a better sense of what I'm about to say. Belief in the divine right of kings and the belief in a providential God who supports that practice runs aground on the discovery that both of these things are the product of moral opinions, opinions crucial to our lives as political animals, that are ultimately incoherent and contradictory. For political animals who are also rational animals, cue Aristotle, and who thus insist that the objects of their devotion be manifest and that their goodness be indisputable, such contradictions make it impossible for us to see them as good and worthy of devotion. They make it impossible to live by them. That such contradictions might threaten the integrity of the Catholic Church as a divine and earthly institution can be found in the novel by the fact that it, the Church, finds Joan's cross-dressing so troubling. And in Twain's view, her cross-dressing was extremely important. After all, Twain, in his treatment of Joan's trial, triples the number of references to her cross-dressing that you might find in the official record of this famous event. Right? He triples it, he over-amplifies it. And I think this is important to Twain because Joan's cross-dressing blurs the distinction between men and women, male and female, and thus invites us to wonder just how much these differences could be rooted in nature, how much they could be rooted in custom, how much do they owe to the contingent and not the necessary. In other words, Joan's cross-dressing excites a kind of categorical crisis that allows Twain's readers to start questioning all of the moral and material and epistemological distinctions associated with clearly demarcated forms like men and women. I have to stress here that this categorical crisis can only be seen for what it is. The significance of these blurring of categories, male, female, just, unjust, only comes to sight for us in view of the preceding reflections on our moral and political nature. Now, again, the preservation of clearly demarcated forms mattered to the church. And not only because they executed Joan for failing to observe these demarcated forms. See, the church didn't just object to Joan's transvestitism. I mean, they did, right? They objected to it. But they also objected to Joan's claims to have conversed with angels. Why? Because her particular account of that intercession indicated that angels had hair and clothes that could be touched. In other words, they were material in nature. Aspects which, if true, would further blur the distinction between the heavenly and the earthly, the divine and the human. Now, for what it's worth, one can find the Catholic insistence on these distinctions throughout many of its rites and customs. You see it in the insistence on an all-male priesthood. You see it in its division between the church militant and the church triumphant, and so on. Now, in Catholic theology, don't worry, we're not going into the depths of this, but the articulation of the distinction between things like divine and human finds one of its most powerful theological expressions in the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, there is not a lot of evidence to indicate that Twain, who seems to have read everything under the sun, ever engaged the work of Thomas Aquinas. but not a lot is not none. So, for instance, Floyd Horowitz, in a perceptive reading of Twain's short story, An Invalid's Story, published in 1877, argues that Twain advances a highly elusive broadside against the Catholic belief in the resurrection, and specifically against Thomas Aquinas' justifications for the resurrection, for belief in the resurrection. 10 years after that, Twain worked closely with the Vatican and the Holy See to successfully acquire the rights of the biography of Pope Leo XIII, a pope we have good reason to recall today for obviously different reasons. But Pope Leo XIII was best known to 19th and 20th century Catholics for his effort to restore the philosophical reasonings of Thomas Aquinas to the heart of Catholic moral theology. And Twain worked closely with the Vatican to get the rights to this book and get them published. And you're telling me Twain didn't know his work on Aquinas and wouldn't have thought deeply about Aquinas? And 10 years after that, as I've just suggested, Twain's last finished novel, the one that he called his best, places at the core of his argument against the belief in a providential God a powerful illustration of the questionable coherence of those moral, political, and spiritual forms whose distinctions, which must be manifest and indisputable, Aquinas tries to defend in his Summa. If we read Twain's personal recollections and find the account of our human nature that he gives us there, if we find that persuasive, then this should lead all those who believe in a providential God and a cosmos ordered towards the human good to a very troubling conclusion. And this would be true for Catholics, yes, but not just Catholics. To come to grips with that conclusion, I think, requires no small amount of grit, no small amount of fight on our part. But I suspect that Twain would want us to embrace that contest and to begin the trouble of grappling with that issue with a grin on our faces. Thank you.